In this video, we're going to finish up with the different types of selectors and take a second look at the different lengths of measurement that you can use. The last type of selector is the attribute selector, and there are many different variations, if you will, of that attribute selector. So basically what the attribute selector does overall is it provides you a way of being able to style a particular element based on the attribute or the attribute and value that it has in the tag, the opening tag. The different types are the existence selector, and all you do, no spaces, is just the element and the attribute in square brackets. Again, no spaces. So this selector that I have highlighted would actually style any paragraph tag that has an ID. Doesn't care what the value of that ID is, it just has an ID. The equality takes it one step further. In this one, it's a paragraph tag that has the ID attribute, but the value of that ID attribute must be summary. Now, if you think about this, you're probably not going to use this very often, because when we talked about ID selectors, we would just have pound summary. That's a lot less to type than P square bracket ID equals quote summary unquote square closing square bracket. Just pound summary is all you need to do. And since your ID should not be repeated, that's an easier way of doing it. The next one is a space selector. This is any paragraph element that has an attribute called class whose value is a list of space-separated words. In this case, one of those would be the exact same thing as XHTML. Now, in the last video, we looked at having multiple classes for an element, and as you saw then, they are space-separated, not comma-separated. So this would be looking at all those that have at least two different classes in the value of the class attribute. And in this case, one of them must be XHTML. We then have the hyphen selector. In this case, it's going to be any P element that has the attribute language whose value begins with EN and is followed by a hyphen. In the case of languages, several times or many times they are followed by a hyphen. We're just using a single pipe and then the equal sign. It is that pipe that is saying, okay, I'm looking for the language attribute and its value has to start with EN dash. The next one is, or actually the next three are all CSS attribute selectors. So make sure that if you're going to use these, that each browser that you want to use them in is actually supporting them at this time. The first one is a prefix selector. This would style any paragraph tag carrying an attribute whose value begins with B. Again, it's the attribute here, not the value. So the attribute name would have to begin with a B. The caret here, which is on your keyboard if you do a Shift 6, that is what is telling the browser to look for any attribute that starts with B. That represents beginning. You'll see that used in JavaScript if and when you ever use JavaScript for regular expressions. You'll see that same caret actually is used to designate the beginning in there as well. The next one is a substring. We use the asterisk here. This is saying any paragraph element or tag whose attribute contains the letter ON. Doesn't have to be at the beginning, doesn't have to be at the end, it can be anywhere. And then the last one is a suffix. This is saying that any paragraph tag carrying an attribute whose value ends with the letter X. And again, using the dollar sign here, you'll see this in regular expressions when you start doing that as signifying the end of a regular expression. So this selector then gets any attribute that ends with X. Okay, remember these are the attribute names, not their values in these last three that we looked at. So let's look at an example of this, and we've got several paragraphs here. First one has an idea of instruction, second one an idea summary, third one has two different classes, important and XHTML, language, English-US, that's US English as opposed to British English or anyone else's English, class begins, class contains, and class suffix. So you can see all the classes there, and they're pretty much named so that we could utilize them in our style sheet. In our style sheet then, our first paragraph selector is for any ID. So this is going to put a border of 1 pixel solid black around every paragraph tag that has an ID selector. The paragraph with the idea summary is going to set the background color to, I believe that's a dark gray or a dark grayish blue, but it's only the one that has the idea of summary. The third one is an example of the class that has multiple classes separated by a space, and one of them is XHTML. In that case, we're going to change the border. We haven't talked about these properties yet, but we will. But we're changing it to 3 pixels as opposed to the default 1 pixel. So it's going to have a much thicker border. Then we're going to look for one who has a language attribute, and it starts with EN dash. Remember, the pipe is short for I'm looking for a hyphen or a dash. That pipe on your keyboard, by the way, is the shift key on the backslash right above the enter key, if you're not familiar with the pipe. So on that one, we're going to change the color to FFFFFF, and we're going to set the background color to black. So white on black. The next one, anything that starts with a B, we're going to change the color of the border this time. It's going to be 3 pixels, so it's going to be thicker, but we're also changing the color of it. Then we do one that contains on, changing the color to white, setting the background color to a darker color. And then lastly, anything that ends with an X. And we're changing the color of the border but leaving it at 1 pixel. So let's take a look at how this all comes out. And you can see the differences there. You can see the 3 pixel border, you can see the background colors. So all these were done using the attribute selectors and looking for various things within those attribute selectors. Little addition to what we've already talked about as far as lengths earlier in this chapter. We can basically categorize these in 3 different ways: as relative units, as absolute units, and as percentages. With the relative units, there's actually 3 types of those. The pixel, which is the most common, which relates to the resolution of the screen, and both the EM and the EX, which both relate to the size of fonts. So the relationship here, 1 to the screen, the other 2 to the size of its inherited font. The pixel is referred to in your code as PX, and there will be no space between it and the number of pixels. It's by far the most commonly used. A pixel is the smallest unit of resolution on a screen. When they give screen sizes, they're talking about the resolution of pixel, and pixelated images just means that you can see the little squares of colors. The size of a layout that uses pixels as a unit of measurement depends upon the viewing medium. So most computer screens have a resolution of 72 dots per square inch, or 72 dpi. Mobile devices would have a lower resolution than computer screens for the most part, except for the iPhone and some other similar smartphones which would have a higher resolution. A table that's 500 pixels wide would be 9.9444 inches wide on a 72 dpi screen. If you're going to print it on a 300 dpi printer, it would be 1.666 inches. And on a 32 dpi screen, it would be 13.888 inches. So you can see how the resolution of the screen is going to impact the display size of whatever you set. So just because you make it 500 pixels, it's not going to show up necessarily at the same width on everybody's computer screen. One of the issues that we have with programming in HTML is you have no control of that user's screen or browser that they're using, and you have to be ready for all circumstances. The EM, which is used fairly often as well, not quite as often as the PX, but it gets a lot of use. It's the equivalent to the height of the current font. So one EM would be the same as whatever font size that element is currently inheriting. Size of fonts can vary throughout a document as well, so the height of an EM unit can be different in different parts of the document. In addition to that, I talked about before in a different video, users can change the size of text in their browser so the EM unit can vary in relation to the size of the text that the user has selected. So always keep that in mind. The EM unit is most commonly used for measurements of elements that contain text and for controlling space between text, such as the line height. The EX should be the height of the lowercase x. Because different fonts have different proportions, the EX is related to the font size and the type of the font. And you're not going to see EX used very often at all, if ever. But it is out there and it can be used. And then there's the new ones that we talked about earlier as well when we showed the sample of what these different sizes look like. Rem units are equal to the font size of the root element. Remember that. It's not the size of its inherited element or the styles that it's inheriting from its parent. It's actually getting its size based on the root EM. So what's set in the HTML. This would allow you to use font relative sizing with less complexity, as we talked about earlier, than with the traditional path of EM units or percentage-based height and widths. I think I mentioned this before as well, but the VH units are equal to 1% of the viewport height. The VW unit are equal to 1% of the viewport width. This allows for viewport relative layouts. If the viewport changes, these units scale proportionally. One good example where this should be used and where that viewport changes, your smartphone and your tablets. How often have you had a picture and you're looking at it horizontal and you change either the tablet or your phone vertical to get a look at it a different way? And the screen changes. Well, now the VH and VW have changed as well because you've changed how the viewport is displaying it. So you're going to see a lot of the VH and VW used in places where they expect this to be used for handhelds or tablets. And then you could use your style sheet and use the VH or VW and have the style sheet specifically targeting handhelds as opposed to screen or print. The absolute units, these are used far less than anything that we've talked about now. I don't recommend ever using these things because they're more scaled to print than they are to a pixelated screen. But you have the point, pica, inch, centimeter, and millimeter there. and then percentages. This just gives the value in relation to another value. Percentages are used a lot for width, actually, width and height. And when you set the percentage, say 50%, set the width equal to say 50%, you're saying that you want that particular element to be as wide as half of its containing element. And when we start talking about layouts, we'll talk more about these containing elements and how they play into things.